Hello and welcome to our discussion on the sole community hospital and Medicare dependent hospital qualifications. In this video we're going to be talking about the two different types of special hospital qualifications, SCH and MDH. We'll be talking about the qualification itself, the application process, and termination of both statuses. So first of all, just an overview of the regulatory and policy authority behind each payment type. So we have 42 CFR 41292 that deals with the sole community hospitals, and there's also additional policy in the CMS Pub 15-1, Section 2810. Now the idea with a sole community hospital is that the policy and the regulations provide for enhanced reimbursement to protect the hospitals that are generally considered to be the sole source of hospital health care in their area. We'll define that a little bit further in just a bit. For Medicare-dependent hospitals, the regulatory authority there is 42 CFR 412-108. The idea behind the MDH program is that it provides enhanced reimbursement to protect small rural hospitals that are predominantly serving Medicare patients. So the reimbursement that we're referring to here, the enhanced reimbursement, the hospital-specific payments and such, those are going to be discussed further in a separate video. This video is mainly about the qualifications and the criteria that must be met. So we are going to first talk about the sole community hospital qualifications. We're going to start at a high level and then we're going to dig into some more detail. But the general high level for the SCH qualifications are that the hospital has to be considered to be in an isolated location, at least hospital-wise. Now, generally, one way to meet this, one easy way to meet this would be to be 35 miles or more from another like hospital. In this situation, it could be an urban or rural provider. Or, if you're just in a rural area, if you are in a rural area but you're not quite 35 miles from the nearest hospital, there are other criteria that can come into play. Now, some of these criteria deal with service areas, they deal with weather or travel conditions, or the absence or inaccessibility of other hospitals. Now, again, this is very high level. Now we're digging into the details here. So there are really 5 options, 5 combinations of criteria that can be used to establish sole community hospital status. Option 1, which again is the easiest as far as the effort to go through for the review. If you're greater than 35 miles right off the bat, and again 35 miles from the nearest like hospital, then you can be a sole community hospital. Whether you're urban or rural, it really wouldn't matter. The urban or rural status, the bed size status, none of that would matter if you can demonstrate that you're 35 miles from the nearest hospital. Option 2, if you are 25 to 35 miles from the nearest hospital, first of all, you have to be rural. For anything under 35 miles, you have to be rural to qualify for sole community. And in this situation, you have to be rural. And in this option, you can prove that your hospital has admitted at least 75% of the area's total admissions within your 35-mile radius or your service area. So the regulation, the way it reads, it talks about 25%. It basically says no more than 25% of the total admissions can be admitted to some other hospital. Of course, the inverse is that you have to admit at least 75%. We'll talk about the service area and the admissions in just a bit. But option 3 here, we have the 25 to 35 miles again, rural. And in this case, let's say you did not meet the 75% test, but you would have met the 75% test, except that some of the inpatients in your area needed special services that your hospital didn't provide, so that inpatient had to go elsewhere. In that situation, if you can prove that there were enough of those patients to cause you to not meet the 75% test, and you had fewer than 50 beds. So that's the extra criterion there. In that situation, you can be a sole community hospital. Now, if you don't meet those criteria, you can go to option 4, which actually qualifies all the way from 15 to 35 miles from the nearest hospital. If you can prove that the topography or weather conditions rendered other hospitals inaccessible for at least 30 days in each of the 2 out of 3 years, then you can qualify as a sole community hospital without needing to prove service area, bed size, or anything like that. Now, this is one of the rarer situations because we're generally talking about mountainous terrain, things like that, road closures, remote roads, where, again, you'd have to prove that they were inaccessible for at least 30 days in each of 2 out of the 3 years. That's a very rare qualification. And option 5 would qualify for any mileage if you can prove that because of distance, posted speed limits, and predictable weather conditions, the travel time between the hospital and the nearest like hospital is at least 45 minutes. So in that situation, you can become SCH eligible as well. Now, this one I will mention is one that you would need to go through. You need to document up front. But CMS has also mentioned that MACs would need to verify this. So this would require potentially an on-site review, an on-site testing of the mileage. We got that information a few years back. So that's just one thing to consider there. But of course, you'd want to document it yourself first to make sure that you even thought you met the criteria, and then we would be providing assurance as to that criterion by testing it ourselves. Now, one of the additional notes that's been added into the regulations at 41292A4 deals with remote locations. So if you have a main hospital that all of a sudden has a provider-based campus, so they have a remote campus, the regulation requires that both of those campuses have to meet the same criteria. If your remote location causes you to fail the criteria, then you're no longer sole community hospital. You would lose that status. So that's just something with the regulation there. So as you can tell, most of these criteria, most of these options require road mileage reviews to hit the various mileage requirements. And these should be documented through some sort of mapping tool like MapQuest, Google Maps, anything like that, where it clearly shows, first of all, what are the nearby hospitals, nearby like hospitals I will specify, and we'll see that in just a bit. So what are those nearby hospitals, and what's the mileage between your address and their address? So we would need that documentation, and of course we would review it on our side. But the like hospital, if you dig into the regulation, it specifically talks about like hospitals. So you're not looking at every single hospital that's nearby. You're not looking at a rehab hospital. You're not looking at a psych hospital, anything like that, if they're not providing the same level of care. More specifically, if the other hospital that's in your area, if their acute level total inpatient days are less than 8% of your total inpatient days, then that other hospital does not have to be counted. So they could just be a couple miles from you, but if they serve such a small percentage of acute level inpatients, then they're not going to be counted. They're not going to cause you to fail the mileage test. Now, the service area. So one of the criteria, one of the options, the scenarios that we talked about required a test of the service area. Now, first of all, the service area by definition is the area from which a hospital draws at least 75% of the inpatients during the most recent 12-month cost reporting period. Now, I will mention this 75% just coincidentally is the same number as the test of admissions, but they are two different things. First, you have to define your service area in order to even look at that admission test. So you look at your service area, you look at what area, what zip codes, for example, do you draw at least 75% of your inpatients. Now, the way we would find this out, you'd have to rank your admissions in your hospital by zip code. You know where the patient resides. And you would start with the zip code with the largest number of admissions. You'd rank it from largest to smallest. And you'd go down the list. You'd have zip code 1, zip code 2, zip code 3. As soon as the cumulative percentage of those admissions hits 75% of your total admissions, then those are the zip codes you need. You don't need any further zip codes in your list. So once you get those zip codes, now you know your service area, and when you'd have to take a look at all the inpatients in that service area, and you'd have to identify where were they ultimately admitted. What hospital did they go to? Did they go to your hospital, or did they go to some other nearby hospital? You would need to have 75% going to your hospital to meet this criterion right here, this option 2. So that's what that is all about. Now, if you're able to gather that information from your state hospital association or whoever, whatever other area, or just internally, that's great. If you need to request that CMS get involved, you can send this to us as a MAC, and you can send your request and we can forward it on to CMS. But the request has to have your full name, your full provider name, the provider number, Medicare provider number, and some sort of statement that you're requesting admissions information for the purposes of qualifying for sole community hospital status, and you need to list the zip codes that you service. Now that's information you should have. You should know your own inpatients and what zip codes they resided in. So the listing of zip codes is what you would need to send us, and then CMS is going to take a look at all inpatient admissions from those zip codes, from your service area, and they're going to identify what hospital they were admitted to. You would also need to include the provider number and provider name and the address of any hospital located within your service area or within a 35-mile radius, whichever is bigger. So as far as the application process, you're going to need to make a request through the MAC, and we'll see the email address. It's audit.advisement@wpsic.com. You can send that via email to us, and it has to include, obviously, your mileage documentation, any information about the service area, if that's the criteria you're going to use, the patient origin data, all of that. Now, these will be reviewed by us, by the auditors in the MAC. By regulation, there is no time frame for this review, but of course, we're trying to get these completed as quickly as possible. We make a recommendation, so we cannot make final approval. We can only make a recommendation to CMS. There is no regulatory time frame for their review, but again, they try to get those done as quickly as possible as well. The effective date of this status will be 30 days after the notification, and it will remain in effect unless you voluntarily terminate it, or if there were any changes in circumstances, which we'll get to in this next slide. The change in circumstance, the termination of the sole community hospital status. Prior to 10/1 of 2006, the requirements for any sort of review of these criteria were pretty vague. There was no real reporting requirement on the part of the providers, and there was no review requirement on the part of MACs. Of course, if CMS ever identified that an SCH no longer qualified for the sole community status, they could certainly terminate it at that point. But this was strengthened in the August 18th, 2006 Federal Register. In this change, providers are now required to report any changes to their status within 30 days to the MAC. Now, the status changes would basically be those things that could cause you to fall out of sole community status. In other words, the things you initially qualified for, do you no longer qualify for them? For example, is there now a change in distance between your facility and the nearest facility? If there's a brand new facility that opened up, it's it's expected that you're aware of that. It's your competition. It's expected that you're aware of that new facility. And if it's closer than 35 miles or 25 or 15, depending on which criteria you met, you would have to report that to us. If there's a change in urban or rural status, so again, most of the scenarios, most of the options for sole community status require you to be rural. So if for some reason you are now urban, if you've been reclassed or redesignated as urban, then that would obviously cause you to fail that requirement. If you met the one option that required under 50 beds for the bed size, then of course that change would, if you went above 50 beds, that would cause you to fail that requirement. And travel time, if you met that criteria, that's also a pretty rare one. But if any new roads opened up that make your travel time less than 45 minutes, then you would fail that requirement and your sole community status would be terminated. So it is incumbent upon the providers to report any changes within 30 days for those items. And furthermore, if the provider fails to report those status changes, then there would be a retroactive determination, retroactive back to the time that the change was noted or should have been noted. And of course, it's subject to reopening time frames according to the 2006 Federal Register. However, in 2012, this was updated a little bit further, and that self-reporting requirement was strengthened. There was a discussion of issues of fraudulent sole community hospital status treatment and any sort of exception to a 3-year reopening requirement. Reopenings can be opened by CMS or a MAC at any time if there's evidence of fraud. There is no 3-year time frame in the case of fraud. So if it becomes known that the provider was intentionally withholding that information to keep and maintain their sole community hospital status, that could possibly be considered a fraudulent situation there. So there's the question of possible recoupment all the way back to the beginning, even past 3 years. So for this reason, we just basically say that the voluntary termination, if you know you no longer meet the status, voluntary reporting, voluntary termination, in this situation, it's in the provider's best interest to avoid recoupment down the road. Now, if you terminate the status, you can regain the SCH status if you meet a different criteria, different option, after 1 full year has passed. So that is sole community hospital status. In another video, we're going to be talking about the actual payment mechanisms and the base rates, 2 different videos. Now we'll move on to the less complicated of the two, the Medicare Dependent Hospital Qualifications. Now, the very first thing I want to say about Medicare Dependent Hospital status is that when this first was issued in 1990, this was not intended to be permanent. It's expired multiple times throughout the years. It's been extended multiple times throughout the years by Congress. It expired in 10/1 of 2012, but was then extended later on. It was most recently set to end 9/30 of 2022. There was a retroactive, very temporary extension issued by Congress just very recently. So now the termination date is December 16th. Of course, this is pending future legislation as well. So with Medicare Dependent Hospital status, you must be located in a rural area. Even if you were reclassified to that rural area, you have to have under 100 beds. And you cannot already be classified as a sole community hospital, which sounds a little odd, and as we'll see in the payment discussion, sole community hospitals actually receive a little bit more payment than a Medicare dependent hospital. So this little piece of the regulation definitely seems odd, but what they're saying is you cannot be both at once. Now, the main criteria for Medicare dependent hospital status, if you just look at the name, Medicare dependent, what this means is that this hospital depends very heavily on Medicare patients for their utilization. Specifically, you have to have 60% or more Medicare patients, either by counting days or discharges. So 60% of your total patients' days must be Medicare patient days, or 60% of your total patient discharges must be Medicare patient discharges. Now, this does include the Medicare Advantage days, also known as HMO or Medicare Part C. The other important thing to note about this is that the regulation requires that it's at least 60%. 59.9999% is not at least 60%. There is no rounding allowed for this. That's been brought up multiple times over the years, and it does not meet the definition of at least. So as far as this 60% requirement, the original regulation, when it was first issued in 1990, said that you had to meet that 60% utilization in your base year 1987. Now, as new providers were issued over time, keep in mind this was only intended to be temporary at the beginning. That's why the 87 year was used. After it got extended a few times, right around 2001, the regulations were revised to have a rolling utilization review instead of just a base year review. So if you do not have a 1987 base year, or you have no evidence that you met 60% in that base year, then every single year when we do a desk review, we're going to take a look and see whether you meet the 2 of 3 years 60% test. Now again, what we'd be looking at 3 years, including the most recently settled one we're working on. We look at that year plus the last 2 years to see if either under days or discharges you met the 60% for 2 of 3 years. Again, HMO days are included. There were issues with billing HMO in the past. Those have been rectified and resolved in recent years, but there were issues in the somewhat distant past. So as far as the MDH application, just like sole community hospital status, you must file the request to the MAC. Now, there is no extra documentation needed. We can identify whether you're rural, we can identify your bed size from the hospital cost report, and we can identify the 60% test. The only information that might be needed is if you had some sort of alternative HMO day documentation, which, by the way, that would really no longer be valid anymore. That was back when there were issues with the billing, so that's a non-issue at this point. Now, the contractor, the MAC, will review it, and the regulations do require that this be reviewed within 90 days. So we review it, and we can actually make a determination as a MAC. We do not have to submit to CMS and wait for their approval. We make the final determination, and the status change will be effective 30 days after that determination letter. Now, as far as the termination, so again, there can always be voluntary termination if you don't believe you qualify, or maybe you're trying to qualify for a different provision like SCH, for example. There's always that voluntary provision, but the termination can also occur at final settlement when we review your 60% test. So if we find out that, let's say in the past 3 years, you met 2 of the years, but now that we're final settling the next year, now that 3-year period is going to roll forward. And now if we find that 2 of the 3 years were not met, then this would be terminated effective 30 days from the date of notification. Of course, if you lose your rural status or change your bed size, this would also terminate the MDH status. And by definition, if you failed the 60% test, then you have to wait until another cost report is settled for us to check a new 3-year period, and you'd have to wait for that to reapply to prove that you met 60% under the new years. Now, as far as applications, just a reminder, any sole community or Medicare dependent hospital application should be sent via email to audit.advisement@wpsic.com. And just a final quick word, I've mentioned throughout this video that we have some additional videos in our YouTube channel. Of course, we have the volume decrease adjustment video that's been out there for a while. That's one other payment that can possibly be used for sole community hospital or Medicare dependent hospitals. But we also have a video on the basic hospital-specific payment mechanisms, and we have a video on the base years and the base year calculations. So hopefully this information has helped you to identify whether you may qualify for SCH or MDH status. I thank you for your time and look forward to talking to you in the next video.